This is the story of Kenneth David Kaunda, the now late former President of Zambia, who stood out as one of the most humane and idealistic leaders in the post-independence age in Africa. Kaunda played a notable role as the leader of the Frontline States in the long confrontation between independent Black Africa and the white-dominated South, which only came to an end in 1994 with the election of Nelson Mandela as President of South Africa. What made Kaunda one of Africa's most loved icons of the last century was how he used the newly independent Zambia to provide money, host guerrilla logistical bases for anti-colonial guerrillas fighting fierce regimes in neighbouring Zimbabwe and apartheid South Africa. Yet, despite all of his successes, especially on the international stage, Kaunda also had his shortcomings as a leader. And what comes to mind was the one-party rule in Zambia as well as the collapse of the country's economy. This eventually led to protests against his 27-year rule of Zambia. In this long overdue episode of African Biographics, we'll look at the life and legacy of Kenneth David Kaunda, a stalwart of the struggle against colonialism and Zambia's first president. Kenneth Kaunda was born on 28 April 1924 at Lubwa Mission in Chinsali in what was then Northern Rhodesia, now present-day Zambia. He was the youngest of 8 children. As a child, Kaunda became very fond of football and was also passionate about music. His father was a minister and teacher who had left Malawi in 1904, and his mother was the first African woman to teach in colonial Zambia. Initially, the young Kaunda followed his mother's footsteps, becoming boarding master and then headmaster at Lubwa Mission. This was from 1943 to 1945. Young Kaunda then went to work at Salisbury, which is now Harare in Zimbabwe, at the Salisbury and Bindura mines. In 1948, he became a teacher at Mufulira for the United Missions to the Copper Belt. But soon young Kaunda began to show an active interest in politics. Northern Rhodesia at the time was a British protectorate. 1949 would see Kaunda return to Lubwa to become a part-time teacher, but he resigned in 1951 and he became the organizing secretary for Northern Rhodesia of the Northern Rhodesian African National Congress, the ANC. He also rose to become the deputy to the leader of the ANC, Hering Kumbula. At the time, Kaunda was a firm opponent of the Central African Federation, the CAF, which came into being in 1953. Also known as the Federation of Rhodesia and Nyasaland, the CAF was a political unit that was created in 1953 and consisted of the British settler-dominated colony of Southern Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, and the territories of Northern Rhodesia, which is now Zambia, and Nyasaland, which is now Malawi. The latter two territories were under the control of the British Colonial Office. From the 1920s, white European settlers in the Rhodesias had sought some way to come together in order to counter the overwhelming numerical superiority of the African population. After the Second World War, the growth of secondary industries, as well as greatly increased white immigration in Southern Rhodesia, compounded by the copper boom in Northern Rhodesia, led white political leaders and industrialists to advocate even more for the amalgamation of these 3 territories, Northern Rhodesia, Southern Rhodesia, and Nyasaland. This was expected to provide larger markets and to be able to draw more freely on black labor, especially in Nyasaland. Now, the African population in Northern Rhodesia and Nyasaland consistently opposed the formation of this federation, which they feared would be dominated by Southern Rhodesia. And they turned out to be right, as throughout the 1950s, policies in the federation were seen to be largely to the advantage of the white population of Southern Rhodesia. Meanwhile, back in Northern Rhodesia, by 1958, 2 years of economic distress as a result of the fall in copper prices had increased the unemployment rate amongst the African population and had forced many into even greater poverty. So now the young leaders in the ANC, including Kaunda, Sikota Wina, and Simon Kapwepwe, were committed to the idea of creating an independent African state that would be free of British colonial rule. This nation they envisioned would be named Zambia. However, this vision clashed with the one held by other Congress members, including Henry Nkumbula. That year, in 1958, Nkumbula was in favor of taking part in the elections that would form a new constitution for Northern Rhodesia and allow about 25,000 Africans to vote, while the others, led by Kaunda, sought to boycott the election. This division led to a split in Congress and to the formation of the Zambian African National Congress, a new party that would be led by Kaunda, Wina, and Simon Kapwepwe. On the 12th of March 1959, Kenneth Kaunda was arrested for holding an illegal meeting and was sentenced to 9 months in prison. By then, he was seen as the main opponent of the CAF in the colony. While he was in prison, he suffered a serious bout of tuberculosis and he was then released on January 9, 1960. Upon his release, Kaunda promptly formed a new party, the United National Independence Party, also called UNIP. His aim was to take Northern Rhodesia out of the CAF and achieve immediate independence. He then launched a massive campaign of civil disobedience. Under the 1962 constitution, which he had initially opposed, Kaunda and UNIP contested the October elections. The result of the election was inconclusive and UNIP joined Nkumbula's ANC in a coalition to form the colony's first government with an African majority, in which Kaunda became Minister of Local Government and Social Welfare. The Central African Federation came to an end at midnight on December 31, 1963, and a new constitution for Northern Rhodesia provided for self-governance. In January of 1964, UNIP won a second election, claiming 55 out of 65 seats. With UNIP now controlling the National Assembly, it was only a matter of time before British colonial rule would end in Northern Rhodesia. On October 24 of 1964, Kenneth Kaunda officially became the first president of the independent state of Zambia, and by then Kaunda was at the height of his popularity and prestige. Events to the south of Zambia, meanwhile, were building up to a crisis. Nationalist wars against the Portuguese had begun in both Angola and Mozambique, while in southern Rhodesia, the end of the CAF was merely the prelude to a unilateral declaration of independence that was to come on in November of 1965. In the unilateral declaration of independence, Southern Rhodesia's Prime Minister Ian Smith had declared his territory's independence from Britain. The principle of majority rule was considered irrelevant by the Southern Rhodesian government. Following the UDI in Rhodesia, Kaunda declared a state of emergency in Zambia. He was to make many pleas to Britain to intervene in Rhodesia, but they fell on deaf ears. Meanwhile, in South Africa, Hendrik Verwoerd was implementing the system of apartheid throughout his country. South Africa also controlled Zambia's neighbor, Namibia. These developments in Southern Africa were to have a profound impact upon the fortunes of Zambia over the next quarter century and upon the career of Kenneth Kaunda. Throughout this whole process, Kaunda became a great friend of the South African liberation struggle, as he was close to veterans of the liberation movement such as Oliver Tambo, Walter Sisulu, Chris Hani, and others. At the height of the struggle against apartheid, Kaunda did something that had never been done anywhere else in the world. He brought in Oliver and Adelaide Tambo to live with him at the Zambian State House. This was specifically so that they could benefit from the presidential security. Kaunda maintained his support for the liberation movements despite the policies of the apartheid government, which were aimed at destabilizing his government. Also, to show his commitment to the liberation struggle, at one stage, 25% of the intake at the University of Zambia, Zambia's only university at the time, were freedom fighters who were also provided with scholarships. Kenneth Kaunda also imposed economic sanctions against Rhodesia in the 1970s at great cost to his country's own economy, and in the late 1970s, he allowed Zambia to be used as a base by African nationalist guerrillas that were led by Joshua Nkomo of Zimbabwe. Kenneth Kaunda really became a key figure in the continuing conflict between the Zimbabwean liberation movements and Ian Smith's Rhodesia. It was also these attacks on Rhodesia during 1977 that forced Ian Smith to agree to talks at the end of the year 1977. On numerous occasions, and notably in 1979, the colonial Rhodesian Air Force in neighbouring Zimbabwe made dramatic air raids into Kaunda's Zambia, of which some people claim that they used chemical bombs, in turn killing hundreds of independence fighters from Zimbabwe. These raids were by Selous scouts of Ian Smith's Rhodesia, supported by the apartheid regime's South African Defence Forces. Their targets were strategic government liberation movement points, including the ANC, SWAPO of Namibia, as well as ZAPU. In 1986, apartheid South African warplanes made forays into Kaunda's Zambia, briefly dominating the skies and killing refugees and guerrillas housed in refugee camps. This aim was to punish and deter Zambia from hosting anti-apartheid South African independence fighters. These heavy tolls only emboldened Kaunda, as well as deepened global sanctions on apartheid South Africa. This would eventually help in crumbling the apartheid government. At home, meanwhile, Kaunda became involved in a permanent balancing act between the different ethnic groups that make up Zambia. He was also re-elected into power in 1968. Tribalism in politics was and still is widespread in Africa. So during the late 1960s and the early 1970s, Kaunda stepped up efforts to prevent ethnic competition between political parties and within the ruling party, UNIP. He made frequent changes to positions at every tier within the public sector, resulting in rapid turnover of both identity and personnel. Many politicians at the time were increasingly using the language of ethnicity or tribalism to attract support and power. In response, Kaunda was careful to divide up important ministerial posts to people from various ethno-linguistic groups in order to maintain a power balance between these main groups. Kaunda's chief legacy has to be the fact that he united the different groups in Zambia into a united nation that not only stuck together without civil war, but stuck together in defiance of all the pressures brought to it by the apartheid government in South Africa. But despite all of these successes, Kaunda was not totally a saint and was not without fault. At independence, copper was booming and providing Zambians with a relatively high standard of living. But a turning point in the fortunes of Zambia and Kaunda came with the fall of the copper prices in 1973. It was the beginning of what turned into a permanent economic crisis. When the copper boom came to an end, Kaunda showed little capacity for dealing with the new economic problems that the country faced. Zambia sank into debt. Throughout the 1980s, steadily deteriorating economic conditions substantially reduced Zambian living conditions. Kaunda was simply too busy on the international stage to deal adequately with problems back home. Also following inter-party violence in 1973, Kaunda declared that Zambia would become a one-party state and all political parties except his UNIP were banned, and this was through an amendment of the constitution after the signing of the Choma Declaration. This stifled any form of political competition in the country.
The conscious decision of the people of this nation, Zambia will soon be a one-party participatory democracy. This is why the deliberations of this National Council.
An attempted coup of 1980 emphasized Kaunda's growing unpopularity and isolation from those he governed. The decade that followed witnessed a steadily deteriorating economy, an ever-widening circle of critics, and constantly falling living standards for ordinary Zambians. By 1990, Kaunda's reputation had sunk to an all-time low at home, where demands for a multi-party system now came from both the National Assembly and UNIP, with the newly formed Movement for Multi-Party Democracy, the MMD, holding nationwide rallies to demand change. After months of stalling as pressures mounted, Kaunda agreed to a new constitution in June of 1999. The MMD party was led by Frederick Chiluba. At the time, Chiluba gained a reputation as a champion for workers' rights and democracy. As a member of the then newly established MMD, Chiluba led the struggle to end Kenneth Kaunda's one-party rule. In 1991, Chiluba won the country's first multi-party elections to become Zambia's second president since independence. Elections for the National Assembly were held in October of 1991 and resulted in a huge defeat for UNIP, which only held 25 seats to 125 seats for the MMD. In a rare feat, Kaunda accepted defeat and chose not to hold on to power. To Chiluba he said, "My brother, you have won convincingly and I accept the people's decision." However, there would be further run-ins between Chiluba and Kaunda in the near future. After leaving office, Kaunda clashed frequently with Chiluba's government. He planned to run against Chiluba in the 1996 presidential election, but was barred from doing so after constitutional amendments were passed that made him ineligible. On Christmas Day in 1997, Kaunda was arrested on charges of inciting an attempted coup that had occurred earlier that year in October. However, Kaunda denied any connection with the disaffected junior army officers who led the bid to topple President Frederick Chiluba. Upon his arrest, Kaunda then decided to go on a hunger strike after having been detained under emergency laws. It was only after a visit by his friend and Tanzania's former president, Julius Nyerere, that he decided to end the hunger strike.
Listen to my elder statesmen, and they are saying, keep him away from prison. So I called an emergency cabinet meeting last night, and I informed them, and we agreed that we will not keep him in prison. We will move him from there and restrict him in his own house so that the former First Lady doesn't have difficulties in seeing my dear elder brother, Dr. Kaunda. He will consequently be restricted in his own home, but there are conditions on this restriction, and I hope he cooperates, because if he doesn't, we may be compelled to take him back to where he thinks he must stay.
Kenneth Kaunda was released 6 days later, but he was placed under house arrest until all charges were withdrawn in June of 1998.
Today, God is great indeed. I'm out, but I've not been told why I was in prison for 5 months and 7 days. Why, I still don't know.
The following month, Kaunda announced that he would resign from his role as UNIP's president once a successor was chosen. However, the lack of agreement regarding his successor caused a rift within UNIP, and ultimately Kaunda did not resign until the year 2000. In 1999, a judge ruled that Kaunda should be stripped of his Zambian citizenship because his parents were from Malawi, and furthermore, because of that fact, Kaunda had held office illegally for most of his period in government. Kaunda mounted a challenge, and his citizenship was restored the following year when the petition that generated the court ruling was withdrawn. After retiring from politics, Kaunda was involved in various charities, with much of his energy going into the fight against the spread of HIV and AIDS. Kaunda lost a son to the disease. He began to take public HIV tests as a way of convincing Zambia's public leaders and ordinary citizens to get tested for the virus and in turn beat the rising infection rate. Kenneth Kaunda died on the 17th of June 2021. He was 97 years old. Though he was politically imperfect, Kenneth Kaunda remains an icon of nationalism and of courageous leadership in Africa. Let me know in the comment section below what your thoughts are on the life and legacy of Kenneth David Kaunda, the first president of Zambia. If you enjoyed this video, then don't be shy to like and share. Thank you all for tuning in. This has been Tatenda for African Biographics. Until next time, cheers. Have a good one.